All right, Theo, here's the question that everybody has when they're talking about rankings. Do rankings even matter? I mean, if you're going to argue over two or three guys at the top of your dynasty rankings, if you're at the point in a dynasty startup draft that you're ready to take a running back, I mean, why do we argue over who's number one, who's number two? Is it more tiers, or is the ranking actually does matter?
I think that the tiers matter more. I think that there's certain foundational pieces you need to have a strong dynasty roster. And, the rankings correlate somewhat to the tiers, but to me, it's tiers. Although I would rather have Bijan Robinson than pretty much any running back in dynasty right now. If you tell me it's a comparable player at the top, like a Ken Walker, it's somewhat the same level of asset, in my opinion.
Right. So let me ask you that. There is a good argument that Bijan Robinson should be the number one guy in Dynasty. I mean, we did that with Zeke a few years ago, right? About 6-7 years ago, there was an argument that Zeke Elliott was the number one Dynasty running back when he was a rookie. And we did it with Barkley a little bit. When I say we, I mean, there was fantasy people that are passionate about Dynasty talked about it. What are you seeing about Bijan Robinson? I mean, at least those arguments happened once they were landed. Bijan Robinson's not even landed yet. And yet, I can't tell someone they're wrong for wanting to elevate him to the top of the top tier. So what is it about him, in your judgment, that warrants that kind of consideration right now?
I just think he's somewhat of a flawless prospect in terms of the size, the athleticism, the vision, the receiving ability, and the fact that he's only 21 years old. He's going to come into the league. He's going to play the season at 21 years old. I think that if Breece Hall would have stayed healthy last year, you would have had a real argument at the top as to the very top echelon of dynasty running backs. In terms of startup value, I think Bijan Robinson's going to settle in non-super flex leagues. I think he's going to settle in as the third overall pick this summer when you're talking about the highest money level dynasty leagues. So to me, Bijan really checks off all boxes as a player. And then when you take a step back and you bring up the fact that we don't have the landing spot, I think the kind of a little bit of the shroud of mystery helps, because you can't really poke holes in the situation. You can't poke holes in pretty much anything about him. And in Dynasty, we need to be paying attention to trade equity. Trade equity matters. You might say, hey, I would never trade this guy. But at the end of the day, you're getting more for Bijan Robinson, sight unseen right now, landing spot averse, than you are for Ken Walker or a Breece Hall or and pretty much anybody. So to me, it's a fairly easy selection for him at the 101.
Right, like I could say, like, oh, Ken Walker's my number one guy, but if I go into the trade market in my particular league, there's going to be 4 or 5 people minimum that disagree with that, and that will give you more value for Robinson. So if you're in that startup, that makes sense. And also, I guess the case for Robinson is not only, you talked about his elite prospect traits, but also lack of a definitive other option as the consensus RB1. Like in past years, it was like Le'Veon Bell or Jamal Charles or David Johnson. Like there was all guys that had a case. There's really like a smattering. There's like, oh, this guy's Christian McCaffrey's too old, or Ken Walker doesn't catch passes, and Jonathan Taylor had a down year. So it also could be lack of other consensus options at this particular position.
Yeah, it's kind of a perfect storm. You had this past season, you had only one first or second year guy finish as an RB1. And you could say, there was some bad luck to that. Obviously, Breece Hall was headed in that direction. Ken Walker, if he would have received the kind of volume he did for the second half of the season, would have ended there. ETN had a weird stretch, but you have a very kind of an older group of running backs that are producing the points, where dynasty managers, there's obviously going to be some red flags with taking on, a 27-year-old with that sort of startup equity. So I completely agree with you on that point. It's kind of a perfect storm for Bijan Robinson to come in at the right time. Like if Christian McCaffrey was 23 and a half instead of, almost 27, this would be, we could have a hard conversation, but it's kind of despite the fantastic production you do have to take into account tread on the tires, the age of the player. I mean, that kind of stuff really, really matters to us in Dynasty.
I'm here with Theo Gremminger, does the GOAT District podcast, newly signed on to handle all the podcasting, head of podcasting at Playerprofiler. And Theo's here to announce today that we together, Theo, I, and Matt Kelly, the Podfather, are going to relaunch the Sonic Truth podcast and all Dynasty podcasts, which will go live on the Playerprofiler YouTube feed and all their other feeds on Tuesdays at 11, starting this week, right, Theo?
Yeah, we're starting out this week. I'm extremely excited about this. This is going to be an awesome thing to do with you and Matt. I think it's going to be one of the best Dynasty podcasts going, and it's truly an honor to be able to step into, a podcast that really was one that was every week listening for me.
Yeah,
when Matt and Nate were doing it. So it's really exciting, and I'm super thrilled about the opportunity.
Yeah, Sonic Truth is appointment listing for a lot of Dynasty players, and we'll put the link in the video description below. I'm here with Theo Gremminger, and we're talking about Dynasty running back rankings, and I think it's one of the most interesting years for Dynasty running backs because of the uncertainty at the top. I don't think, you really need us to tell you that in most non-superflex startups, you're going to take those two big receivers first, and then the conversation, when I say Jefferson and Chase, and then at least the conversation begins at pick 3 for a running back versus whatever receiver you have there. Would you agree with that as a general statement in single quarterback?
Yes, because I do think that there is some uncertainty at wide receiver 3 overall. You might pick 10 guys that you think are very sharp at Dynasty, and they might all have different opinions of that wide receiver 3. So
let's illustrate that point. Like, who would be your wide receiver 3 if I'm making you pick right now?
If you're making me pick right now, it's probably CeeDee Lamb.
Right. And I would have Amon-Ra St. Brown there, right? Look, we're two guys that play a lot of Dynasty, so there you go. You might have Amon-Ra 7 spots lower. I have Lamb, so that just illustrates your point. Yeah,
it's a little bit of indecision there. Then you also have the fact that the tight end position, there's nobody that really stands out. You can't, a year ago, people were taking Kyle Pitts that highly, but now there's obviously a ton of red flags with that. Travis Kelce's a little old, obviously too old to take there. So there's no tight end that you would put that kind of equity into. So it really comes down to wide receiver versus running back. And you bring up Amon-Ra St. Brown, you can make an argument against him. CeeDee Lamb, you can make an argument against him. Jalen Waddle, you can make an argument against him. A.J. Brown, an argument against him for spending that kind of Dynasty startup capital. So for me, my Dynasty startup 103 is Bijan Robinson. If you're a Ken Walker guy, though, Ken Walker can be the Dynasty startup number 3 overall. It just kind of pick your poison with which way do you want to go, or try your best to trade up to the top 2 because those wide receivers are pretty good.
Yeah, no, that's what it seems like. There's a tier of 2. And in Superflex, they'll, depending on how you look at the quarterback position, there might be 6 or 7 quarterbacks. I think that, everything in the first round looks good depending on, what you're comfortable with from an injury risk. We had our friend Crackshot in the chat to say Javonte Williams is the RB1 as soon as he heals up. He's actually on my list to ask you about. Javonte Williams, I think he's in real trouble here for Dynasty, Theo Gremminger. And it's not just because, it is the injury, right? It's like he's almost a virtual lock not to be himself, even if he plays week 1 for the month of September. We saw what happened with J.K. Dobbins last year, where the whole year was basically a bust. And that's another year. And you got to think it's reasonable thought process to think that Denver's going to add a significant backfield mate for Javonte, whether that's an Alexander Madison or Miles Sanders or David Montgomery, whoever it is. So where are you going to be on the Dynasty value of Javonte?
So I was in a FFWC kind of experts best ball draft. And redraft. But I think there is definitely, we have to look at the redraft rankings in correlation here with the Dynasty as well. Bijan Robinson, shout out to Johannes in the chat. I see Javonte as a sell. I kind of agree with her there because Javonte, you're seeing going in the 5th, 6th, 7th round, depending on the format. Javonte, you bring up the fact that he won't be available for week 1. I think that's a pretty good bet. I think that we're a lot less certain at his availability than Breece Hall. If we were betting on who's going to be back first, I think it's a better bet to bet on Breece Hall. You also had a lack of elite production from Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams we didn't really see it. Obviously, we can criticize the previous Denver coaching staff, and obviously the usage for Javonte was very confusing to start the year. I believe in the talent for Javonte Williams, but I think that treating him as a truly elite prospect, like a Bijan Robinson or a Ken Walker, is the wrong way to go about it. I would actually be more apt to acquire Javonte Williams if I was in a rebuild mode, where this season didn't matter to me as much. That would be the kind of team that I'd want to take Javonte Williams on. If you are a dynasty contender right now and you love your roster, I would try to move Javonte. I think you could do it two ways. I think you could use Javonte in a package deal to get one of the running backs that Alan and I are discussing. Use him as a piece to go get a Ken Walker to go get, or you could use him as a, hey, do you want your team to get younger and try to take on a Christian McCaffrey, an Austin Eckler, a guy that we really believe in the production this year that might be a little bit older. So Javonte to me is kind of on an island. You've got to have him somewhere in your top 15 running backs for dynasty rankings, but it would be really hard for me to put him in a truly elite tier.
And I guess the best way to illustrate that point about Javonte Williams is over the next 2 seasons, who's going to score? If you have to make a bet on this, Theo, who's going to score more fantasy points this season and next season? Javonte Williams or 27-year-old Nick Chubb through the next 2 seasons? Who's going to score more fantasy points?
Chubb's a great name to bring up. I think Chubb is a guy that's a little bit underrated in Dynasty right now, and I would bet a lot of money that it's going to be Nick Chubb.
Right, but the Dynasty market is going to have that completely the opposite. You could trade Javonte Williams and get Nick Chubb and some draft capital for that. I just think that is, as an industry, we're okay at predicting what's going to happen right in front of us. We're terrible at predicting what's going to happen 2 seasons and 3 seasons out. That's why, and I don't think this is an original thought, but it's certainly the way that I go about Dynasty, is I like to play in 1 to 2 year windows, maybe 3 year windows when you're talking about the 2 big receivers or the quarterbacks, or 3 to 4 windows. Right? Other than that, just play it like it's redraft, but obviously you have to keep other factors in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at things. I would say with the running back position, I would almost go with a 2-year window.
Max.
Just because the turnover at the position is so strong. And this year especially, we're going to see a lot of turnover in the free agent market. We're also going to see a ton of running backs get drafted on day 1 and day 2. I think all you need to do is go back a year and look at kind of startup values, and you'll say, whoa, look where this guy was going. Well, look where this guy was going. Leonard Fournette was an interesting pick in Dynasty startups last year. Now, good luck getting a second rounder for him. Oh, yeah. So it's a fickle marketplace for running backs, but I think that Allen's spot on with the 2-year window.
Yeah, it's funny because Leonard Fournette, it just in an Underdog Bestball the other day, went in the 11th or 12th round. I mean, he's sure to land somewhere where the value is better than that. I mean, even if he's in a committee, like I'm just trying to think of like a very less than average situation for him. Let's say that he ends up going to be backfield mates with Derrick Henry. I would still think that he's bound to return more value than that. Or if he's the guy that the Chargers get to finally have a second running back with Austin Eckler, no matter what, he's going to have more value than that. And certainly it'll be, like you said, you probably even can't get any. You have to wait till he signs. And just talking about Underdog Fantasy, if you know the 2022 NFL season's over, but fantasy football never stops at Underdog Fantasy, the easiest place to play fantasy football right now. You can draft an Underdog big board tournament with a $1 million in total prizes, $200,000 to first place. You think you know the incoming rookie boards will burst onto the scene in 2023? If so, now's your chance to draft them at a value. Maybe not now that the combine already happened, but all you have to do is join the big board, draft your fantasy team, and that's it. In best ball, as you know, there's no waivers, no trades. All you have to do is just draft it, set it, and forget it. Right now, you can get double your deposit using the code RWNFL. Go sign up. And there's also a link in the video description below. All right, now that we paid some bills there, we're continuing on talking about our Dynasty running backs. Yesterday, I commented on an interesting tweet you talked about, and You like Tony Pollard in redraft going, on that 2-3 turn in Dynasty. He's around the RB12 now. I'll just I'm interested in the argument for him. Other than he's a good player. I'm just saying it's not a great situation. So why are you so bullish? And not when I say you, there's a lot of people for good reason that I guess are on Tony Pollard, but given the fact that he's probably facing a 3-month recovery from the fractured tibia, and also that Zeke is going to be there, why should people thinking of Tony Pollard as a top 12 running back in Dynasty?
So I think he's right on that RB1 borderline for Dynasty. But in terms for redraft, I believe he's going to be available for week 1. And I think that I think that he is a very interesting case because the tread on the tires is not there. You bring up Zeke Elliott. Zeke Elliott has been kind of a boon for Tony Pollard's long-term value, where he's going to be 26 years old to start the season, but he could be headed to more of an Austin Eckler type trajectory with his career, where Eckler had the benefit, the long-term benefit of having Melvin Gordon around, where there was less like massive volume, less risk of injury. You bring up the injury for Pollard. It was unfortunate, and the timing certainly didn't help the fact that it was in the playoffs. But I think in the overall tread on the tires and the fact that they're willing to spend the franchise tag on him in Dallas, them doing that and not using it on Dalton Schultz, who is a big part of their offense and a constant weapon for Dak Prescott, I think speaks volumes as to how worried Dallas would be about the injury. This particular season, I think if they were very worried about Pollard, I think that they would have multiple options where they could have moved on to this very deep free agent class. They also could have just simply drafted a running back on day 2, where there's going to be a lot of them. They were linked to Bijan Robinson for a while. That seemed like a very Jerry Jones-like move to, spend whatever he needed to get the in-state prospect. I don't think they're going to go about that direction. I think it's going to be Tony Pollard. And you bring up Zeke Elliott. Zeke Elliott looked like he was running with a piano on his back to end the season. He looked so bad in the playoffs. I think it's more of this is a guy that's been loyal to the franchise. This is Jerry Jones's guy. We're going to have him finish his career, hopefully, as a Dallas Cowboy. He's going to take some sort of a team-friendly deal, and this is going to be the Tony Pollard show. So I'm very bullish on Pollard. My 2-3 turn was a prediction for him. So, in Underdog, I don't have the current ADP in front of me, but it was lower. I know in FFPC where I was playing, you were getting him lower. I drafted him once at the 3-4 turn, which I like that value for him.
I'm looking it up as we're talking. So, but I think you're right. I think that's right around where he's going. In the 4th round, he's not making it into the 5th round. He's just not. Yeah,
he's just not. And I do think that that's just going to be that'll be a popular way to start drafts this year, because I think we bring up the Dynasty startup value. I think that those same 2 guys, Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, are going to be, when it's said and done, the 1-2 in redraft. I think it's going to go wide receiver this year. I think that's the way things are headed. There'll be some Christian McCaffrey people at the top, as always, but I think most drafts are going to have one of those wide receivers. So I think a very popular start will be Justin Jefferson, followed by most likely a Tony Pollard or a running back like him. Start out with your RB1 at that 2-3 turn. So I think kind of that's where he's headed. And there's a chance he could go a little bit higher, because if he comes back and the health is not a concern, Pollard could have a really, really big year. I think that he's the kind of guy that could challenge for RB1 overall numbers. We've seen the explosiveness. We've seen the receiving ability. I think that the change in coordinators is not going to be a threat to him. I think Schottenheimer has found a way to, as unexcited as we are about Schottenheimer being the Dallas coordinator and Mike McCarthy taking on a larger role, I think we can bet on them featuring the running back. Mike McCarthy has said time and time again, to his own detriment, how much he wants to pound the rock. He wants to feature the running back. So I would bet big on Pollard this year. And I think the franchise tag, it's not great for the long-term dynasty value. But I think it is it certainly shows the confidence Dallas has in him, at least for this year. And I think he's a good enough player that he can earn a long-term contract next year.
Yeah, the franchise tag, they only used it because he was injured, right? They can do a wait and see. They probably would, if he was healthy and had the type of playoffs he would have, he would be getting a 3-year deal that's really a 2-year deal. I mean, he's in that window. And most dynasty running backs, especially when you get into like the age 26, 27, 20, they're all 1-year deals anyway. It's like, they're basically, mercenaries, right? Dalvin Cook and, then obviously Melvin Gordon, those types. I mean, he's even older now. Alvin Kamara is heading that stage. Derrick Henry, well, I mean, he might be the outlier, the exception. But yeah, once they get there. So I want to talk about basic dynasty strategy here with running backs, because it's a tried and true dynasty strategy that a lot of people swear by is get those young wide receivers, pay the inflated prices early, and then just fill in with the running backs. But yes, sure. Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, they do have elite value, insulated trade value, actual value, all those things. But my argument is always that it's a strategy to go after a few elite young running backs early, especially since the prices are falling as everyone goes for the wide receivers, because the minute the draft's over, they have the reverse effect of buying a car, right? When you buy a car, you drive it off the lot, it depreciates by 15, 20% the minute you drive it off. Running backs, 20-year-old, 22-year-old running backs appreciate in value the minute the startup's over. You can literally get more for what they're worth. So I'm not saying, because listen, you're in how many dynasty leagues are you in, Theo?
I couldn't even tell you a lot. You're going to mute this out. Shout out to the IRS. I would not like to reveal how much.
All right, enough said. Well, I'm in 38 leagues. I'm trying to shed a few actually. So you can't spend time, but I'm just talking about in principle. Most sane people, sober people are in, they're 5 or 10 or even 12 dynasty leagues. But drop in the comments how many leagues you're in or how many you're going to be in this year. But I think that's the reason, and that's the argument, because try trading for a 22-year-old running back in Dynasty, just in an established league. Good luck. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Certainly these younger running backs, especially if you're talking about pre-NFL draft, if you're in a startup right now, these guys like Roschon Johnson, like Devin Achane, like Zach Charbonnet, these guys could gain a ton of value based on, where they're drafted. And I do think that this is a year where a lot of these guys are going to get drafted in the second round. I think a lot of people are on, a number of these guys being drafted in the third round. But I think when it's all said and done, the Bijan factor is going to be kind of like a gravitational pull where Bijan's going to go a little bit higher than we think. It's going to have Jahmyr Gibbs go a little bit higher than we think. So I think a number of these teams are going to go after and try to get their running backs in that mid-second. And I think you'll see a ton of these guys go from the mid-second to the early third. So yes, drafting these younger running backs, no one really gains more dynasty value than a young running back that flashes. You're talking about a guy that you might be able to trade for, like a Ken Walker. A year ago, people were being critical of him as the 102 in a lot of these leagues. I think a lot of players took him at the 102. They received some criticism for that, especially with all the wide receivers behind him. Right now, you could trade Ken Walker for Garrett Wilson plus. You could trade him for Chris Olave plus. I mean, basically, he's getting you multiple first-round pick equity. And I think that there's a couple of these running backs that could do so, like a Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs might be a guy that a year from now is worth exponentially more in Dynasty than you'd have to spend on him in a startup right now. Bijan's kind of already priced where he's at, but it's when you look at the running backs like Gibbs and the next few, those are the guys that could really, really gain a lot of value.
And there's going to be this year's Dameon Pierce. There's going to be a running back that we like that goes in the early 4th round that basically has a clear runway to a job. And that guy is, everyone's going to argue draft capital versus situation. And in running backs, I mean, situation really is all that matters, because if you're thinking about a player in a 2-year window for a running back, especially, when you're not talking about the top of the draft, if you're sitting at, in your rookie drafts at pick 10, or if you have like a mid-round 2 pick, I mean, Dameon Pierce last year, it wasn't uncommon to see him go at 112 or 2.6. Like, it happened a lot of variation on his ADP within that window there. So yeah, I think that they're the best thing. Like, we get excited about some of these rookies as far as this guy ran a 4.54, this guy ran a 4.33. at the end of the day, I have found that the order they're drafted in, I guess that means draft capital, is literally the most important thing when at least sorting out your first set of rankings.
Yeah, I think that you have to look at draft capital. I think that does matter a great deal. Certain times you want to look at landing spot.
No, yes,
especially when it's a clean profile guy. Like if somebody gets drafted ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs, but Jahmyr Gibbs goes 10 spots behind him, but we like the landing spot. You can't overthink that one.
I agree.
But yeah, I think that your Dameon Pierce example was a great one. I think Rachaad White is another one where Rachaad White, a lot of people got him in second round of dynasty drafts last year. Now Leonard Fournette's out of the way. He's a guy that you could easily get a first rounder for, a back end first rounder for right now if you wanted to sell. It happens every single year. Tyler Algier, another one. Algier, ended the year so well. You gained a ton of value in him based on where you took him last year.
Yeah, the other one is Isaiah Pacheco, which, and if you do a lot of rookie drafts like we do, he was maybe being drafted in the 4th or 5th round, probably 5th round of rookie drafts. And then, I saw some crazies reach up into the 1st round for him. We all mocked it, but it's not looking too bad now, especially since the Chiefs have openly said there's teams that are looking to trade for Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Not that he was a threat too much, but hey, it's a boon to the confidence that the Chiefs had in Isaiah Pacheco. What do you think the biggest mistake that even experienced dynasty players make when it comes to the running back position in our existing leagues and startups? What are some common errors we should look out for?
I think one of the most common errors is paying for last year's points. I think that you have to tread on the tire matters, and what a team did last year stylistically is not necessarily what they're going to do this year stylistically. An easy way to think about it is last year's price is not this year's price. A guy like Josh Jacobs, who I think, it would be disingenuous if we didn't put him in the top 12 for dynasty rankings based on his age and what he did last season and the fact that he's back in the same team situation. However, you look at the sort of volume he had last year, that should scare you a little bit. If you can get Josh Jacobs for a reasonable price, by all means, go ahead and do it. But what's a
reasonable price?
For him, I would have him more towards a back-end RB1 price. So depending on your format would matter too. So like when we talk about dynasty, there's different roster size leagues. Like I play a lot of FFPC dynasty. If you're a classic dynasty player where you're playing, in sleeper or MFL and your roster size might be like 35 spots, it's a little different.
And just to let everyone know that the FFPC format is, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but you basically keep 14 guys. It's like an insane keeper league more than it is like a dynasty league. And then you have to cut 12 or 16 or whatever. It's something like that. So, right. Rookie picks aren't as valuable. So you really need those 1st and 2nd round guys if you're going to keep them to hit. And obviously Josh Jacobs would be above that cut line of keeping. So you don't want to, you have to be the draft picks become different in these sleeper leagues, MFL leagues, where you have 30-man rosters plus a 10-person taxi squad. Those 3rd round picks, if you collect those, right, those add up. Those mean something because you can hold the Josh Palmer for multiple years, or you can hold David Bell. In FFPC, you cannot hold a David Bell.
Yeah, you're right about that. It's every year, no matter how confident you are in your trading skills. In your roster management skills in FFPC, you end up cutting somebody you're a little bit uncomfortable cutting. But yeah, Josh Jacobs. So to put a price tag on him in an FFPC, I would much rather have the 102 or the 103 than Josh Jacobs. When you get down to like the 104, I think then you can have a conversation based on where you're at this year versus where you're at long term. Going and getting the money matters. The idea for Dynasty is not just to have like an attractive roster full of like young, exciting guys. At some point, you really need to cash a check, especially when you're putting in big entry fees. Yeah. So I would say it's roster specific. But for me, if I was a team that was somewhat rebuilding, I wouldn't want a piece of Josh Jacobs. I would be looking to sell and kind of get out. We don't have, a whole lot of confidence in terms of, the long-term Las Vegas Raiders strategy. I don't think that they necessarily do. They had an opportunity to get Josh Jacobs at a long-term contract last year and certainly spend less money. And now they're franchise tagging him and spending a ton. So I don't know. It's with a 1 year window though, I would love to have Josh Jacobs.
Right. Yeah, I think last year I made a trade for him. I traded him away for when I was on the clock for Chris Olave. So that guy won the trade that year. But obviously, that's like a classic rebuild versus win now team, right? I mean, Olave for Josh Jacobs. It seems now you would obviously take the Olave side of that. But last year, before Olave played a snap of football, it was an interesting trade.
I had a similar situation last year on a team that was going for the money. It ended up winning some money. I moved Drake London to get Josh Jacobs straight up in an FFPC league. So that's the kind of trade that could really, really hurt me for the next 4 or 5 years. But again, you got to go get the money sometimes in Dynasty, or what are we doing?
I think the biggest mistake that people make also is is that perpetual rebuild. And also you said it, I actually have a diagnosed name for it. It's called sexy roster syndrome, when they just load up their roster with picks and with young players, unproven guys. And, oh man, just look at that. And, people call it roster baiting, all that stuff. But yeah, the sexy roster syndrome really is one of the biggest mistakes. And people are in a perpetual rebuild. The minute somebody's worth or gains dynasty value, they want to sell. It's like, wait a second. Sometimes it's okay to just hold the guy and win. There was a poll on Twitter. I reference it all the time on this podcast. And it was, what is your favorite part about dynasty fantasy football? And even though it was the first place, only about 35% of people said winning, Theo.
Yeah.
Another 30% said trading. Another people said collecting rookie picks. I mean, so basically you go into any given year in your dynasty league, there's only 4 people. You're not competing against 11 other people. You're competing against 4 people, 5 people max. Everyone else by week 3, they're 2-3, or week 5, they're like, I'm out. So that's why I think that, you have an 8% chance, right? What is it? It's about an 8% chance to win your league, something like that.
Yeah, it's a 12 team, but in Dynasty, if you're going for it, you're only competing against a few others.
Should always go for it, is my point.
It's a great point, and I think we might have a philosophical difference on, whether a productive struggle could win. Certainly I've seen some very successful players utilize the productive struggle, but yeah, you make a great point on that, where you draft a redraft league, your home league, you have 12 people going for it when they draft. A dynasty startup, a number of teams are going to kind of eliminate themselves from the start based on their startup strategy. It's become such a popular startup strategy to trade down and get future firsts, or to trade down and maybe be able to accumulate more young assets. So you can already tell from your dynasty startup, you might be competing against, 7 people. Then a few teams get off to a slow start and don't want to kind of work to get themselves back into the championship mix. So like you said, you're basically playing a 4-man league. In FFPC, it's a 6-team playoffs. When you get into it, 2 teams get a bye. But of those 4 teams that are competing, to kind of get to week 2, maybe even 2 of them have a strong enough roster in terms of being able to challenge for the top spot. So it's an interesting dynamic. And yeah, there's a lot of people who are continually trying to add that new hot thing instead of kind of banking the points from a sure thing.
Well, what you referenced a moment ago was we had a brief discussion. I'm sure we'll discuss it more in Sonic Truth. Is that productive struggle? Is it good? Is it win now versus win never? And I agree with you that productive struggle, if you could stay disciplined and actually execute the strategy, and just briefly for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's basically punting year 1 in a startup to build your roster over the next few years, right? And the idea is that you're going to draft young players that have a little bit more staying power, and forego some of the proven Nick Chubb, Derrick Henry types. But the reason I say it's win never, jokingly, because most people aren't disciplined. Most people, the minute Amon-Ra St. Brown has that little 4-8 week stretch, they want to sell him for a first. Now, obviously, Amon-Ra St. Brown would probably be worth way more than that. I saw him traded in a lot of competitive dynasty leagues for just a single first, 106 or 108, something like that. he would be worth way more now. So it's, again, we don't disagree. We do agree that productive struggle can work. I just believe that 9 out of 10 people that say they want to do it don't have the stones or the stomach to stick with it.
I think that's productive struggle is something we'll talk about on the Sonic Truth podcast a lot. I think that there's one mistake that people make is, and I don't want to turn this into a productive struggle show, Alan, because we could talk 2 hours about this. But I think one mistake people make is, hey, I really need to get draft picks for next year. And yes, draft picks for next year are a big part of it. But I think that those drafting rookies as part of your productive struggle, especially when you know the landing spot, like for instance, last year, Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, those kind of guys were very attainable in dynasty startups. Right now, you'd have those two guys as wide receiver ones in dynasty. So it's a productive struggle. Your team can flip a lot quicker than some people think. I think a lot of people have like this 3-year idea where they keep accumulating draft picks and then they need to land it. And I think that's kind of the wrong way of doing so.
Yeah. So in theory, we agree, but I'm just saying is even experienced dynasty players muck up productive struggle because one, they think they know what it is. And there's a very specific, very like needle you need to thread here in order to pull it off. But I agree. It's got the upside. For the podcast listening audience, we're going to break right here. Stick with us through the break because when we come back, we're going to talk about a couple of players that are sure to rise in dynasty value over the next 18 months. All right, and we're back. I'm here with Theo Gremminger at the OG Fantasy. You should follow him as I do on Twitter. One of the best follows, I think. A good mix of analysis of. I always think your opinion's interesting. I first, became aware of you when you were doing Matt Kelly's podcast, and right away, I thought your episode was one of the best of the year. I'm glad that you and I are going to be working together over the next 4 months or so, doing the Sonic Truth podcast, which is going to air on live on the Player Profiler feed Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern time. You can catch the replay, and then it will be in the Player Profiler podcast feed as well. And we're here talking about running back rankings for Dynasty. So, all right, it's fun to debate the top 10, the top 12. I think that if we just put them in a snow globe and shake them up, we would mostly agree on at least 90% of them. But I want to talk about the players that nobody wants that are going to be popular redraft picks. Okay. We're going to talk about, Dalvin Cook, Aaron Jones, Derrick Henry. And I always find it interesting, the gap in the dynasty ranking versus the redraft ranking. That group as a whole, and you can include whoever you think are in there. So first identify that stinky cheese group right there. And how do you treat them in dynasty? Do you want those guys, or are you just actively trying to get rid of them? Older running backs, stinky cheese running backs.
I do want some of the older running backs when I think my team is good. If I have a top 6 roster, I'm much more likely to take those guys on. At some point, you've got to say, my team is not good enough to win this season, even if things go really well. And even though I think a guy like Aaron Jones has 2 years left, maybe more, taking him on would be difficult. I also don't want to pay for the top end of those older running backs. I would rather take a guy that's a little bit beat up, maybe has a little more question marks about his situation, because I believe in the talent and I believe in his ability to score fantasy points. Aaron Jones is a great name to bring up. Aaron Jones has been, 3 straight seasons of RB1 production. He's got an RB2 overall in that mix. And the last 2 years has just been great. I think that early in the season, and I like to look at Underdog. I like to look at FFPC in terms of the best ball rankings to kind of see where the market's at on guys. Aaron Jones was severely beat up in the early ADP because people were worried about, him not being a Packer. They're obviously worried about the Aaron Rodgers situation, but I think Aaron Jones is a good enough player that he's going to score points no matter who the quarterback is of Green Bay. So Aaron Jones would be a guy that if I'm a contender, I would definitely kick the tires on Aaron Jones. I'll say a couple of the other names. I do worry about cut candidate running backs. Like a guy like Dalvin Cook, a guy like Joe Mixon, these guys that I think could be cut. You're taking a little bit of a risk, a lot of a risk in certain situations to go get those guys because the situation could change and it could change very quickly. Those guys could end up in more of a committee situation than we think. Despite their production, I would have a little bit of trepidation taking them. So I don't mind taking an older running back when I know the team situation more than a guy where I'm worried about them getting cut.
I get asked that question often on the RotoWire message boards and the YouTube comments. And my answer is this, is that it depends on the time of the year to buy them. Like, I would rather buy Aaron Jones for like a first when we get into the playoffs, like in that trade deadline for Dynasty, than pay like 2.1 right now, right? Even though it's a discount right now, I'd rather wait until I actually need him and I know he's producing. So I think that it's okay to, I mean, the best time to sell a player like that, if you are in rebuild mode, is in the season after they have a big game. Everybody knows that. But I think it's also the right time to buy guys like that. So say you're in an established league and everybody needs running backs, right? We already talked about at the top of this podcast that buying 22-year-old running backs, it's impossible. Buying Najee Harris is hard, right? I mean, you know, he would
buying Najee Harris is not as hard as you think. I think it's manager dependent with Najee.
Yeah. No, I mean, he's tradable. That's really where I was going, but it's not like easy. It's not like buying Kareem Hunt.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And that's my point, is that you have to wait till these guys are a little bit more, you can't buy the 22-year-olds, and everyone needs running back. So the best way to do it is cheap, because we just agreed that running backs, no matter what age they are, is most likely best in 2-year windows. We just don't know. Even Ken Walker, 2 years from now, we think he's still going to be this nice stud 24-year-old running back, but who knows what they add through the draft? Injuries happen. So if you're going to buy running backs, because everybody needs them, I think it's okay to wait until the season, because of course you don't need to set your lineup right now, and everyone just needs, I need an RB2. I need an RB2, you know? So I think that's the best strategy when it comes to those vets. I love those type of guys. You know, last year, I acquired the Leonard Fournettes, and, you know, because they're cheap. Frankly, they're cheap. And, you know, people they do not want them on their roster. I mean, it's friend of this podcast. I know he was just on the Player Profiler one, Jordan McNamara. He always talks about, like, what do you care about the price of your house if you're going to live in it? So if you're going to have, what do you care what Leonard, you know, older running back is worth if you're just going to use him in your lineup anyway? So that's how
I think that and Jordan McNamara is a very sharp guy in terms of his dynasty strategy. I think two things you said were really sharp there. Trade timing in dynasty is underrated. Even if you waited, 5 weeks into the start of the season, a few of these managers are going to start out 1-4, and they would rather do a quick rebuild than really try to put the work in to try to get their team back into it. So I think you have opportunities to buy older running backs in season where you're going to pay a little less. And then I do think also the Jordan McNamara, I'll give him a hat tip. He's been on Josh Jacobs a little longer than the community. When Josh Jacobs was a little bit beat up, he was talking and singing his praises. So Josh Jacobs is a great example of this. I think that certain guys, people talk about just being a sell, and then the echo chamber starts repeating itself, whether it's for age, whether it's for a lack of kind of a sexy production or a sexy name. But the age apex is something where a lot of dynasty players kind of just get programmed, for better or for worse, that once my running back gets to be 25, 26 years old, I'm looking to pivot. So if you play in long-term dynasty leagues, you can kind of pick up on these managers that do this. And you with trade timing, with respect to it, certain guys are going to want to sell, when these guys get to a certain age. So the age apex, I think this last season showed the issues with it. We brought up the fact that the older running backs were the ones that are putting up points this year. I think that there's an argument being made that it was like 2 draft classes that were just so good that we've seen these classes kind of last a little longer in their career. But even this year, when we talk about it right now, the 2 top drafted running backs on Underdog Fantasy are Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler. Those guys are going to play the season at 27 plus. So I think you have some great points on all those things, Alan.
couple other guys I want to just ask you about because I can't decide. I help out with the Dynasty rankings. I used to do the Superflex rankings on RotoWire. There's some guys that could really dedicate full time to it. So I just come in and, add a little flavor here and there. And I can't decide what to do with Antonio Gibson, right? I mean, there was a time where we were ranking him as a top 10 running back in Dynasty. And now I can't really find him in like the top 20 in anyone's ranking. And sometimes he's like RB 28. I understand both sides of it. So where's Player Profiler going to be on Antonio Gibson? And what do you think if he's on your roster? Is he a buy? Is he someone that you should try to move off if somebody is interested in him? How you handle him?
Well, it's a very frustrating situation with Antonio Gibson because he had a nice fantasy production for back-to-back seasons of almost 15 points per game in fantasy. Then the Brian Robinson draft pick happens, and the Washington coaching staff, referred to him as a returner. I mean, it was about as bad as it gets. But when he had opportunities last year, he produced. He does certain things that turn off NFL coaches, like fumble the football in untimely times. But as a fantasy producer, he can certainly do well. I'm actually hopeful that Antonio Gibson is not on Washington this coming season. I think a change of pace for Antonio Gibson could really help his career. I can't sit here and recommend you go and add Antonio Gibson shares right now. If you can get him for cheap, go ahead and do it. But I do there are some worries there in terms of his long-term value and in terms of obviously his landing spot for next year.
I saw him traded for 2.7 in a dynasty league that I'm in right now. Do you think that's expensive? Is that the right price in a Superflex 2.7 rookie draft?
Superflex, I think I'd prefer the 2.7 right now. As productive as Gibson has been, I just think that at the end of the day, that 207, not to get too into the rookies right now, but these guys like Tyjae Spears, like Roshan Johnson, like Zach Charbonnet, like Devin A. Chain in a Superflex league can get pushed into that mid-second. There's going to be some mid-second running backs in Superflex this year that you're really, really going to want. But it's not a horrible trade. I've seen more.
And also, right in the middle of the second round, there's always a wide receiver that gets drafted in the first round that no one believes should be a first-round wide receiver, so they get pushed out. It was Brandon Ayuk one year. It was Kadarius Toney the next year, right? Right. There you go. Yeah. Amon-Ra St. Brown was like pick 210 in his draft class, right? Like in the rookie draft. So, yeah. All right. Remember, a couple housekeeping notes here. If right now you could check out RotoWire, unlock the paywall for free. Just go to rotowire.com/pod and just put in your email. That'll get you all of our premium Dynasty content, baseball, if you're into baseball, everything behind there. Just no credit card to put in. You could do that right now. I want you to follow Theo, as I do, at the OG Fantasy. And Theo, just very briefly, tell everyone what you're now doing over at Player Profiler. If they want to follow you, if they want to check out your content like I do, what are going to be your main responsibilities and work that you're promoting right now?
So I write the waiver wire column in season. I also will have at least one more article a week in season. Right now, I'm expect about 1 to 2 articles a week from me in the off season. I'm the senior fantasy analyst, and I'm also the head of podcasting. So I'm doing a podcast with Alan and also Matt Kelly, the Podfather, a Dynasty podcast. I'm doing a high stakes podcast called First Class Fantasy with Billy Muzio. Another, super, super sharp guy. We've competed against each other in high stakes. We've split some teams in high stakes redraft. So that's going to be a really fun podcast. And then I have another solo podcast that's going to be in the works in April. You can also find me in the Goat District podcast, an independent podcast. We're putting out a tremendous amount of content over there. But yeah, mostly find me at Player Profiler, at the OG Fantasy. And you're going to find me with Alan every week in Sonic Truth Dynasty podcast, which is just going to be fire.
We're going to have some fun. You can follow me at Alan Seslowsky. Of course, follow at RotoWire for all of our news and notes and all that stuff. And if you're listening to this on the video, check out the audio stream once I post this up by the time you're seeing this, because at the end of this podcast, I'm going to tag on a little conversation that I had with RotoWire president Peter Shanky about the role of RSNs, regional sports networks, and their role and how that whole model is going away, meaning that you may not be able to watch your local teams the same way that you always have. So that's coming up right after this conversation with Theo. All right, Theo, thanks for being here. And remember, everybody, follow me at the OG Fantasy. And if you have any questions about any of the topics we talked about today, Theo's DMs are always open. My DMs are always open. Good luck in your dynasty leagues and start that